Okay.
Good afternoon and welcome. Connections, Conversations in Science Communication, the future of public trust in times of uncertainty. My name is Jason Pridmore from Erasmus University Rotterdam, and I am the coordinator of the Trustworthy, Reliable, and Engaging Science Communication Approaches, or TRESCA, project. I'm one of the two projects that are hosting this event today. My counterpart, Frank Kapper, will be joining us tomorrow, the coordinator of the RETHINK project. Together with our colleagues in other science and Science with and for Society projects, for over 2 years, RETHINK and TRESCA have been focused on improving the effectiveness of our science communication. We talk about dialogue and conversation. We look at visual practices and development. We determine the incentives and disincentives for science communication. And we look at understanding how to address misinformation, its roots and its manifestations. Today and tomorrow, in a series of panels and keynotes, we will have mixed in-person sessions and online participation, and we invite you to participate and respond, whether that's on Twitter or using our question forum in our online space. Today, I'm also very pleased to announce the launching of the TRESCA MOOC, our massive open online course. This 7-module course, focused on communicating trustworthy information in the digital world, covers the challenges faced by scientists, journalists, and policymakers. In this MOOC, we examine the threat of fake news, of journalism and best practices, the potential for evidence-based policymaking. We look at misinformation and strategies to engage citizens. We invite you to participate, to join us, to learn, and to hear your feedback on this important course. Now, before we begin today's sessions, I'm pleased to introduce Michael Arentoff. Michael Arentoff, the Deputy Head for the European Commission on the Open Science Unit. I'm really pleased to have you with us. Of course, normally I would say something like the floor is yours, but today I say the screen is yours.
Thanks a lot, Jason. First, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you, Jason, for inviting me to open this event with you. I'll give a few short welcoming remarks from the co-founder of the TRESCA project and the RETHINK project. Let me start by telling you what we expected to get out of these projects when we issued the call for proposals back in 2019. First, we wanted to better understand how research results are not only communicated to citizens and society, but also perceived by citizens and the broader society. Secondly, we wanted to identify good practices. So the kind of tools and training material we now see emerging from TRESCA and from RETHINK, like the one Jason just mentioned, the TRESCA MOOC on communicating trustworthy information that is launched with this event. So good practices that would lead to increase the accuracy and the trust in the science results that we communicate. We also wanted with the project to raise attention to the recognition of and the incentives for researchers to engage in science communication. And we wanted to see how we could better measure and assess the quality of science communication. So these were, as you can see, quite ambitious aims at the project's level. And they, of course, reflect the policy priorities that we are expressing on the EU science and research policy. What are these priorities? First, we try with our policy to strengthen science-society links. And this goes well beyond one-way science communication to citizens. And it includes a much deeper interaction between the research system and societal actors. And secondly, we want to, at the end of the day, strengthen trust of society in science. So increase the confidence in the research process and also increase the confidence in the research results. So for us, both the integrity of the process and the reliability, the accuracy of the results is an important part of our policy priorities. Why do we think these should be priorities? Why are these important? Well, so basically, why is it that we have this ambition of opening the research system for cooperation with society, with citizen groups, with public authorities as well? Well, because the effects we have seen in many cases is that research, both in terms of the questions that are addressed by research projects, but also in terms of the approaches that they take in their methodology, get closer to societal needs, to societal values. Very concretely, we see more precise, more concrete research questions being asked. We see a larger scope of the research work. We see more and better data. We see more angles, more diversity in the angles of analysis of the data. And what we hope to obtain also is then not only a quicker and broader uptake of the research results, but also, for instance, changes in behavior that very often need to go hand in hand with the innovation that we try to put forward. We see improved scientific literacy in many cases. And at the end of the day, as I said, we see improved confidence, improved trust in the research system, both in terms of the process that is followed and the results coming out of the research system. How are we supporting this very concretely? Well, we encourage the projects we support to consider this approach in the project methodologies. We support citizens' involvement in doing the science, so citizen science projects. We also support research institutions for them to make changes in their structures, in their processes, so that there is a lower barrier for societal involvement. And we, of course, talking about open science policy, we pursue our open access policy to make knowledge freely available to citizens and to end users. Secondly, as I mentioned, we also have as a policy priority open and transparent research processes and research outputs. So open methodologies, workflows, protocols, open results, not only scientific publications and research data that should be as open as possible, but also the tools that go with it, the research tools like models, algorithms, research software, and so on. So why is this important? Well, because this openness that we're pushing leads to better scrutiny. It leads to better conditions for reuse of various research outputs. It leads to easier ways of testing for reproducibility and replicability of the findings of the research work. And the effect that we want to see is that the research results become more reliable, more robust. So you could say of higher quality. And this again should lead to more trust in the research results, increase the chances that, and here I'd like to quote from the program of this event, that science becomes more of a point of connection than the point of polarization. And if I continue to quote from the program of this event, these deeper science-society links, making new connections, shaping conversations that matter, so listening closer to societal needs and societal values, also increases, of course, the likelihood of greater public relevance of the research and greater trust in science by society. But as we all know, science does not always produce results that are 100% reliable facts. So as a scientist, you should also explain the data and statistical power behind the results that have come out. Any relevant assumptions are also important to explain. And how is this reflected in science communication? And this, I understand, is one of the aspects that will be addressed in the second keynote and in the third panel of this event. Another important aspect to consider in implementing these policy priorities, in many cases, is the inclusivity of the societal engagement and how best to ensure diversity of societal participation in research. So again, to quote, how best to reach all members of society. What do we do from a European Commission side? Well, this is something we promote both in the design of projects also by the instruments that we offer. So for instance, many of our projects launch calls for small grants. And this instrument has proven to be very effective in reaching specific groups of the population, local communities, small associations and CSOs and social enterprises. And again, I can see that panel 1 will touch on some of these aspects. An important scene setter for the initiatives and the projects we support is the context of the growing importance, of course, of digital platforms and digital processes in science-society relations. We have been pushing for more open access scientific publications for more than a decade now. And we also see more and more science-related news on the media, of course. So in general, this is, of course, very good, but it also comes with challenges, it comes with risks. And some of these, as I see it, will be addressed in the first keynote and also in the second panel. So now I think I have mentioned both panels 1, 2, 3, and the 2 keynotes. But let me mention also panel 4, which should give us very important insights as well for how science communication and policy making interact in the best way. How can we best inform policy decisions with scientific findings? What structural barriers are there, like the lack of recognition to researchers for their science communication activities? What can we do in the Commission to facilitate this interaction and tackle any barriers on the way? Well, you can say that we can do a lot, of course, and we're already doing some of it. So, for instance, we have since some years now the scientific advice mechanism. We have, of course, the open science policy in general. We have new actions under the European research area that is also part of open science policy, like the initiative to reform researchers' assessment, and I can mention more initiatives. Let me also mention that at the project level, we're launching 3 new research projects this spring to build a better knowledge base about the linkages of research practices and societal trust in science. So let me stop here and give it back to you, Jason, and I want to wish everyone a very fruitful event. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I couldn't have summarized this better myself. This is incredibly helpful, and actually you covered most all of the items that we will be covering. Of course, not all of the content yet, but I'm really focused on a couple of things that you mentioned here. The intention to try and develop and connect more than one way. This interactive and engaged citizen science approach, I think, is something that will be really helpful for us to think about how we do that well and how we can continue to improve that. I'm also really pleased to also see that the notion of a robust and more open and accessible science is something that the Commission wants to pursue, but of course this is something fundamental to both the RETHINK and TRESCA project. And I'm really happy that actually we can begin with our first panel. This panel is on forging connections with new audiences in times of polarization and misinformation. This will focus on overcoming this disconnect between science and its audience. And I'm pleased to have our moderator, Emma Whitecamp from the University of the West of England, UK.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Welcome,
and it's lovely to have everybody here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person with you. Sadly, you have the background of my office, but there we go. I'd really like to welcome you to this first panel and to welcome the speakers who will be joining me today. We'll be looking at connections, and the panel is going to start with a very brief set of provocations from each of the panelists, followed by some questions that I'd like to ask the panelists, but we really like to encourage you as audience members to please post your own questions. So I believe there's a link or there's an opportunity to ask questions. and then I'll be able to feed those through to the panelists. So please do put your thinking hats on as we begin our presentations. So I'd like to introduce the 4 panelists I have with me. I have Andy Ridgway, also from the University of the West of England, who's going to be briefly drawing on some work that we've done within the RETHINK project. I have Vannessa Mignan, who's an independent consultant and trainer, who will be exploring some of her work with underserved audiences. I have Sara Degli from the Spanish National Research Council, and she's representing, I think, the TRESCA project. And I have Annette Lebmollmann from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, though I believe Annette is currently in South Africa. So she'll be joining us from there. So without further ado, please could I ask Andy if you could provide your 5-minute provocation. I'll be timing you and I'll pop my hand up when it's getting near the end of your 5 minutes.
Terrific. Thanks, Emma. So thanks ever so much. So I wanted to just give a very brief overview of some of the research that we've been doing within RETHINK that relates to our sort of overall question of connecting with new audiences. And there are 3 aspects of the research that seem really relevant to that overall topic. So the first thing that I wanted to tell you about was some research that we've done within RETHINK relating to people's sense-making practices. So RETHINK, like many of the SWOF's projects, was presented with quite a live science communication experiment in the form of the coronavirus pandemic over the last few years. And this actually provided us an opportunity to see kind of in a live context how people were making sense of science. So this research was led by our partners at VU Amsterdam, and it was using the sense-making sort of approach developed by Brenda Dervin, and looking at when people are presented with questions and challenges and uncertainties, as many of us were during the pandemic, how do we resolve those? Where does science communication fit into that? Who do we listen to? Who do we speak with? What goes in on our minds when we're kind of making decisions that relate to the sort of situations that we're presented with? And interviews were conducted across Europe with over 80 citizens who don't necessarily have a connection with science, but to try and understand this sense-making process. And we asked them about sort of moments in time during the pandemic that presented them with big uncertainties, big questions in their mind, and what they did in relation to that. And really what it showed was a real sort of eye-opener for us. And it showed us that an important part of this sense-making is people's pre-existing beliefs in institutions such as governments, but also experts and the media. And these shaped the way that people make sense of this information. But also in terms of seeking out information, it was often from people's family and relatives that they were seeking out information. And also a lot of the information that they were taking in was passively received. So things like via TV and the radio, and people's own values were really important in that sense-making process. Those things that they really held dear acted as almost like a filter on the information that they were receiving. So this, when we presented this to our practitioners, our science communication practitioners who made up the rethinker spaces, some communities of practice, science communication practice that we set up as part of RETHINK, this presented them with some really big questions. And the biggest of this was, well, where do we fit into this? Given the way that people make sense of science, given this sense-making process and people's pre-existing beliefs in the sort of institutions, their own values, where do science communicators fit into sense-making? So when we're thinking about forging connections with new audiences, there are other aspects of RETHINK research that are really relevant as well. And in some of the research, I mentioned before that we developed communities of practice across Europe called rethinker spaces that involved those who communicate science, whether they're bloggers, whether they're journalists, whether they're people who work in press offices, and also some academics as well. And we were asking about the challenges to reaching audiences. And what really became clear is that although new digital means of communication make communication itself far easier. So these days, as long as we have a laptop and an internet connection, we could all write a blog within minutes. However, what we often don't have is a connection with the audience online. What's really missing is a dialogue and connection with those that we're looking to reach. So many of the practitioners, the science communication practitioners, describe the disconnect that they feel when communicating online with audiences. So how do we know what those audiences want? How do we engage them in dialogue when, despite the affordances of online platforms, such as Twitter and Facebook and sort of blogging platforms, that dialogue often doesn't take place? So the final challenge I want to mention that we found within the research in Rethink is when we did a survey of science communication practitioners to try and understand the connections that they have with their audiences. And also we asked them how they conceive their audiences. What do they think of as when they're thinking about their audiences? And what became really clear is that a really large proportion of science communicators across Europe are seeking to reach audiences who are already interested in science. In fact, in our survey, which involved nearly 500 science communicators across Europe, only 1.5% of them said that their audience was not already interested in science. So therein lies sort of several problems from several perspectives in forging new connections with new audiences.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that insight into the data from the Rethink project. I'd now like to move to the studio, and we have Vannessa and Sara in the studio. So perhaps Vannessa, you could provide your 5-minute provocation first, and then I'll ask Sara to do hers, and I will somehow wave my hands at you to let you know that your 5 minutes is up.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Vannessa Mignan Jenkins, and I'm an independent consultant and trainer for science organization. I've worked for and with science organization for the past 12 years. I've engaged with non-traditional audiences for most of that time. I've designed, implemented programs with young people, adult refugees, people with disability, and some of the most excluded people of our societies. I could talk about my own challenges and which approaches I use to forge connection, but since I only have 5 minutes, I would like to focus on ourselves, science communication practitioners, and our organizations. Let us take time for a little bit into introspection. Today, I will go through 3 of the challenges we are facing when forging connection with new audiences. First, the indulgence of false narratives. Second, the comfortable charity approach. Third, the illusion of neutrality. So firstly, the indulgence of false narrative. They don't come because they are not interested. They don't engage because they don't see science as a priority. They can't afford it. I could continue with these sentences that we all heard before. The list of false narratives that drive a practice is long, and we must challenge our assumption and learn from our research. As Dr. Emily Dawson showed us, non-audiences are not deficient in science or behavior, and non-participation is a choice. We need to accept that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with non-audiences. We do not need to change their attitudes, nor do we need to change who they are. If we want to create connection, we need to change ourselves, our practice, our organizations. That takes me to the second barrier, the comfortable charity, or what I like to call, let's be nice to poor people. If we stop seeing non-traditional audiences as in deficit, we also need to stop seeing them as charity case and recognize them as collaborator, contributor, and even creator, an example to learn from. When I was working with excluded youth in Paris region, I was baffled by local initiative, for example, those on climate change. And this eco research and work undertaken by Elizabeth Rescoala, who is, will be a keynote speaker tomorrow, and Lindy Orphier. The communities that we are sometimes prompt to call marginalized are producer of relevant science communication beyond the mainstream. And they have been for decades. We must stop acting as gatekeeper and start sharing power, resources, with those non-mainstream science communicators, and maybe even sometimes deferring to them when it's appropriate. Lastly, we need to tackle the illusion of neutrality, the I don't see color narrative. The way we address inequality is not neutral. Mainstreaming, maintaining the statu quo is not being neutral. If we want to create closer integration between science and society, we have to radically transform how we approach non-traditional audiences. Trust is a two-way process, and we can only take responsibility and action for our end of this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vannessa, for raising those issues around underserved audiences and in particular, the sort of the hugely important role of trust in the communication process. I'd like to now move on to ask Sarah, if you could please provide your 5-minute provocation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Emma. And thank you, Vannessa and Andy. And I much agree with what Vannessa just said. I mean, I think I know enough about the literature which has been produced in science and technology studies to say that the deficit model has made much damage to the community and to the rest of the world, because it's an approach to knowledge highly misleading. As any approach which is based from the perspective of superior knowledge with respect to an inferior knowledge. And I think we all agree here that actually there is just knowledge. I mean, and knowledge can come from community in the forest, can come from places far away from the global north, from the place where the power seated. And I'm actually supposed to talk about disinformation, and which is part of this discourse about power. These days, with digitalization, we can see that there is a lot of information that is channeled through different online channels just to produce some effects in different audiences. So in TRESCA, for example, we focused on this different aspect of digitalization, and we started from the question, what is science? Because most of the people involved in TRESCA are not people familiar with science communication or science communicators. There is just observer that can say they're expert in this field. But the rest of us, and Kurzgesagt, of course, I mean, because they do science communication in a very innovative way, and that's why we wanted them in our project. Because we wanted to focus on the power of visual means and for engaging with young people, for example. That's why I really, when I realized that I wanted Kurzgesagt in our project was when my brother sent me a video of them about quantum physics, trying to explain to me what quantum physics was. And then I realized that these people were really good. So what's going on nowadays in this digital environment in which we have overlapping contents in between, at the crossroad between entertainment and truth creation. It's very complicated. This is something we witnessed at the beginning of the pandemic while we were working on our on mapping the digital debate. We produced a number of words of clouds analyzing data coming from Twitter, and we realized that in the mind of people, politics stands close to entertainment, and which stands close to science. So sometimes we approach these topics as they were separated, as they were isolated from each other. But actually, in people's everyday life, we're talking about vaccine. I mean, for example, I witnessed conversation about whether people should vaccinate their kids. And those conversations are about the management of risks, are about my responsibility as a mother, are about my understanding of science, my understanding of what a vaccine is, my understanding of my identity as a member of a group within a society. So as you can see, it's very multi-layered, and also we need contribution from different sciences. That's why in TRESCA we focus on communicating results from social sciences. Because another mistake we made for too long is just considering science communication a matter of science, technology, mathematics, and engineering. But actually people want to know how their brain works. People want to know when they are vulnerable to misinformation, for example. So I think this is my provocation. My provocation is what's our contribution to truth generation? Because the bit of knowledge I'm adding here is we need to distinguish what is misinformation, which is just about inaccurate information traveling online, from disinformation, which is inaccurate information which is weaponized to manipulate you for an economic or political gain. And we need to take into account malinformation, which is information which is pretty real, accurate, but which is actually manipulated to persuade you or something else. And so I don't want to keep talking, but we have developed some ideas. This is just because I wanted to show you the slide. We've been doing a little bit of research into how to debunk disinformation, starting from the claims which are made, or starting from the source which is spreading those claims. And we found a bit of interesting results. But I want to give the floor back to Emma to keep this discussion going. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Unfortunately, Annette has not yet been able to connect with us, so we're going to go ahead and move along to some of the questions. And I can see we're also already getting questions from the floor, so thank you very much from the audience for the questions. Before I move on to address those questions in particular, I just wanted to pick up on the themes that are emerging. So when our speakers have been talking about things, they've been talking about how our publics make sense of the information. They've been talking about trust and power, and how we conceptualize our publics, and our potential role as gatekeepers if we're practicing science communicators. And then we've had issues around misinformation, truth, disinformation, coming up as well within the discussion. So with that in mind, I'd like each of our speakers to address the question of what they think the key first steps are in forging connections between science and a broader range of societies. And I'd like to ask Vannessa, perhaps if you could address that first, as I think you really were kind of touching on some of those issues in your presentation.
Yes, of course, thank you. I think it's a bit counterintuitive, but the first step is not doing something, but starting listening and working before acting, learning and listening, I would say, if I have to pick one first step.
Thank you very much. Yes, being active listeners and applying those skills to understanding our audiences, that seems a really good first step. And I think that links perhaps to, Andy, to your work. So perhaps I'll ask you to come in second, and then we'll move on to Sarah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so yeah, that really does strike a chord, Vannessa, actually, because some of the work that we've been doing within Rethink is to identify the best practices of science communicators across Europe. You know, what's really working well. And some of this was looking at how people reach audiences that aren't typically connected with science communication. The good news is there's a lot of good work going on. We identified new roles that science communicators are starting to adopt when they're looking to reach new audiences. So ways of working to forge those connections. And one of those things is, just as Vannessa's described, listening. So rather than starting from the perspective of what do I communicate, how do I communicate, and on what platform, some science communicators are adopting the role of listeners to listen to the interests and the concerns of those they're looking to reach out to. But also we identified other roles as well. And some of this that was really interesting actually was around forging connections with individuals or organizations that already have connections with the audiences that we're looking to reach. And so again, it was a science communication role that isn't necessarily directly communicating with an audience. It's more about forging connections to enable those who do have links with an audience to do the communicating on our behalf.
Thanks very much, Andy. Sarah, I just wonder if you might think about the first step that are evident from your work, and perhaps in particular thinking about this sort of the tensions around truth, misinformation, and disinformation.
Yeah, well, following what they were saying, engaging with audiences. I mean, we need to remember that we need to be a little bit careful about with biases. Okay, so the psychological biases that influence us at all levels. So, for example, I remember in another event in which there was a policymaker who made the point that scientists have no problems in engaging in science communication activities in his experience. Because I was telling him that actually women and young researchers have quite an issue, and this is also emerging from the research we've been doing with ZSI in TRESCA, in engaging in science communication activities. Why? Because at the beginning of the academic career, there are a lot of incentive to publish in academic journals, but there are very few or almost no incentive in undertaking science communication activities. On one side, we can say, okay, this could be, it's fair, because you first need to establish yourself as an expert before you talk. But on the other side, the effect we see of this systemic effect is that we have few young women talking. So, which means that when you underrepresent a certain group of people, somehow you are implicitly delegitimizing that group, okay? So, and I see this when a very dear friend of mine, who is a biologist, a very clever one, she goes to her kids' school and talk kids about her research, and people feel inspired, you know, especially young. So with all the debate we have about gender, you know, with all the debate we have about having more people coming from certain backgrounds into science, well, we do need, if we want to engage with these people, we need somehow to find people who can talk their language. I mean, who can also give an example, show with their life that science is something that you can do. I mean, it's not something, you know, for just a certain group of people. It's something for everybody. And the best thing you can do is just having everybody, you know, of course, qualified people. Because the risk, especially when it comes to misinformation, we see it quite a lot, the fact that it's very easy to create, these days with digital means, to create expertise from scratch. I mean, anybody, and this is the problem we have, is that anybody can claim they are an expert in some scientific field, can upload a paper which has not been peer-reviewed, and claim, you know, that their research, and if you add to this conspiracy theories, and if you add to this, you know, the fact that somebody is preventing you from telling the story you're publishing in your research, there are a lot of people who could believe that what you're saying is true. So, and this is a risk. I mean, what we're seeing nowadays is that for sure we need experts we can trust. I mean, we need peer review, we need communities that establish, that have mechanisms to establish expertise. So somehow we need to rebuild the ivory tower, you know, we're missing quite a lot after so much postmodernism, the ivory tower. So we simply need an ivory tower a little bit more inclusive, you know, like in which we have different voices, you know, contributing, and also making clear that science is complex, that there is a lot of uncertainty. And the problem we have, especially when it comes to extremist thinking, is that extremist thinking is characterized by trying to simplify ideas. And so people who are more vulnerable to extremist thinking and narratives are people who have more difficulties dealing with the complexities and uncertainties of science. And this is something we need to talk about. You know, we need to see how can we talk, you know, about issues that make people feel angry or sad or worried, you know, in a way that reassure them.
Thank you very much. I think it's quite interesting what you're saying about the lack of certain groups that are visible from the scientific community and how that might in turn kind of affect willingness to listen or engagement and so forth within the debate. I'm delighted to say that Annette's been able to join us. So I'm going to quickly go back now and ask Annette to provide us with a short provocation, and then we'll move on to another question and then the questions from the floor. So Annette, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma, and hello to everyone. I'm apologizing. I experienced some very deep, difficult technical difficulties here. So I would like to point out 3 topics that seem to be crucial for me for good and fruitful science communication, and 3 topics that are not new, I apologize for this, but that are still very important and difficult to tackle, especially when it comes to communication by administration and bureaucracies. We saw this in the pandemic, that these interfaces that are important to communicate with people who are experiencing a pandemic, for example, who address administration, who try to find information orientation, and when they fail, that's a problem. So I would like to focus a little bit on these. I cannot show my slides. I don't know if you can show them. I can't due to a technical difficulty. So yeah, very good. Thank you. I see it. Thanks a lot. Okay, my first barrier I would like to address is bad interfaces. I brought an example here from Germany. Maybe it's a German problem. this is an interface you used when you try to get a vaccination appointment. And what it is telling you when you put your birthday date, which I did, is that this is wrong, because it's either in the future, which it is not, or wrongly put, which it wasn't. And that's it. That's the communication you get. You're told that it's both, it's wrong on two levels, and that's it. The communication stops there. You don't know what to do. So it's just an example. It may be just one example, but you find more. You find studies on communication by administration is a problem. And so my first claim would be invest in better or good, at least good interfaces with the public. Not only when people are seeking orientation and information like in a pandemic, with an urgent time schedule, with feelings and anxieties, etc., where people really need good interfaces to interact. Because if they find interfaces that don't work well, the trust in administration will be lowered. It's not only that, it's also when you address the public by just informing them in non-crisis situations. We'll also find that if people go to state institutions and want to get informed and they fail to get the information they want, you will lose trust. So investing into interfaces is a very good idea. And it costs money. And the expectations are high because people are used to those platforms that are generated in California, like Facebook, etc., that make people like swim in an environment that's easy for them, that's helping them, that's supporting them, that's open to them. That's, we're helping you, we're talking to you, we are in constant dialogue. That's what the spirit of these platforms is. Not only because people communicate on these platforms, but how the platforms communicate to people. So the expectations are very high, and we cannot ignore this. We have to be open to this media environment. So investing into good interfaces is, for me, a major claim I would like to make. The second one is wrong mindset, or the search for a better or good mindset. So still in the year 2022, I read things like, we want to address the general public. Okay, spoiler alert, there is no general public. You have publics. You have many, many different stakeholders, different publics. You cannot address the general public. It's not possible. So we all have to invest into whom are we going to talk to? Who are these people we want to talk to? The second thing is transparency doesn't mean that you put your internal reports on the website. I still find this, that people think that we found out something great, we put it on the website, so this is transparent, this is outreach. No, it isn't. These kinds, I mean, I'm a bit focusing on the bad stuff here, but you still find it, and we should change the mindset here. Emma is raising her hand. Am I running late?
Yes, I need to encourage you to finish up there.
Okay, it's 20 seconds. The third point I would like to make is preaching to the choir. This is an old problem, but it's still an ongoing problem. So my advice would be, think about all the audiences you have never in your life talked to and start talking to them. And then find out what's maybe going wrong with the whole science communication enterprise, because you're omitting many, many people you just overlook, be it in the global South. I'm in South Africa at the moment. I know a little bit how people feel here, like being talked about, but not talked with. So talk to them and then find out what might go wrong with the whole enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. And I think that was a really timely introduction of some issues that we hadn't yet discussed, particularly things like the technical challenges. and the need for thinking about transparency perhaps in different ways, as transparency being about access as well as placing information into the public sphere. So I think some really, really nice things that have kind of come up there. I'd like to ask our panel now another question, and I'm going to ask that in order for us to have some time for questions from the floor, of which there are now quite a few, if we can just kind of try and respond to this question quite quickly. The question is really about policy and how we can foster a policy environment that, how policy can be used to foster a climate where it's kind of accepted that that we reach out to a broad range of audiences for science. So really thinking about what the role of policy here is in helping us to, or encouraging us to forge these connections. And I wonder, Andy, if you might kick us off with just a couple of thoughts there, and then I'm going to go to Sarah, Annette, and Vannessa, just so you have some warning as the order I'm going to come to you.
Great, thanks, Emma. Okay, yeah, so I've got a couple of things to suggest here. So I think there's a way that policy can create a sort of carrot and incentive to encourage science communicators to connect with those audiences who aren't typically reached by science communication, as well as scientists to do that. And I think that's through the sort of routes of funding that are available for science and for science communication. And for those funding sources to not only encourage people to connect with audiences and have conversations, but to actively reach out and engage with audiences who aren't typically reached through science communication. So making more funding specifically available for this, and potentially even some kind of award schemes and structures. So there's already some really good practice here. So the European Research Council Public Engagement with Research Award does recognise those who engage with audiences who are outside their domain, and it's that kind of thing that if it's more widespread, that it would encourage this kind of culture of connecting with a wider range of audiences. In terms of the second point, I mean, my background is as a science journalist. I've spent most of my working life working for commercial organisations that communicate science. And so what I fully recognise there is that there's a certain incentive for those to connect with the audiences who are already interested in science, because, you know, that's where your audience are. You're reaching out to people who have that pre-existing interest. The challenge often for commercial organisations is it takes time to build connections with audiences who don't typically have that interest. But training can help, definitely. And so within Rethink, we've been developing some training materials which would help science communicators connect with a wider range of audiences, building on the findings of the best practice that we've found within Rethink, including developing new roles to reach underserved audiences. And I think broader implementation of training that encourages those connections with underserved audiences would be really beneficial for commercial entities as well as those who work in publicly funded organisations too.
Thanks very much, Andy. Some interesting insights there around policy connections. Can I go to Sarah, please? So I'm conscious of time, so yes, if we can keep the responses quite brief.
Yeah, I mean, we have an entire panel tomorrow about policy, so it's not much I can say, actually. My impression is something we saw is how policymakers themselves engage with science communication. It's fascinating. I think we will learn more about it tomorrow. And because I think at the core of this question is how we understand science communication. You know, and so depending on how we define science, then because communication is something that, of course, is needed in all our activities. Horizon already force researchers to engage with other stakeholders. It is true that what I can see is a lack of professional communicators engaging with, I mean, having news media, for example, professional news media, or professional communication agencies involved in Horizon project, just to help people like me or other stakeholders, you know, communicate what they do. Because it's true that we are not expert, and sometimes we do not know how to do it.
I think it's a really interesting thing there about the different people involved in science communication and who we're thinking about when we're thinking about how we can forge connections. So whether that's forging connections with scientists themselves, or whether we're actually thinking about how to encourage those other intermediaries, science communicators, to broaden their audience remit, as also Andy mentioned. And Vannessa, I expect that's an area that you might have something you'd like to add to.
Yeah, of course. When I think about policy, I'm always coming from the point of view of how research can inform policy. And I think there's a lot of research done, and RETHINK and TRESCA are two good examples. And I'm sure that there's a lot of learning that can be implemented as policy. So I would say, like, collect all this knowledge that is out there and transform them into policy. For me, I will add, I think reaching audiences and non-audiences is very on the side of what we are doing. And if we're not focusing on how we can make everything inclusive, we are making things exclusive. So is good science communication possible without engaging everybody? And that will be my last comment.
That's an absolutely powerful and pointed question, which I really think might be worth us picking up as a further set of discussion, for sure, because this is at the heart of it. Of, you know, if through the ways in which funding is put forward, there are certain groups that are easy to reach and therefore easy wins for us as science communicators, then of course we're not reaching out to those harder ones at times. So for sure, I don't mean harder to reach, but harder for us to reach, harder for us to create connections with, requiring more effort from us. So I think that's absolutely a fundamental question. Annette, would you like to comment on the question of how policy can help us to foster connections?
Yeah, I'm so subscribing to everything that has been said. I would just add one thing. It's again a thing of mindset. And of course of money. You need money to do this. I think good science communication, inclusive science communication, means to invest time to analyze well your audiences and to get in touch with them, maybe not on science topics, but finding out why do they feel disconnected? Why is it? And so there's kind of a phase of researching your audiences before you start to talk about science with them, talk or do any media activity, whatever, but communicate with them. You can only by knowing where they are and why they are feeling disconnected. So in our research, we found out that people just feel this is not done for me. So where does this feeling come from? And it's very different. It's a cultural thing, it's a national thing, it's a language thing, it's whatever. So you have to invest at this point before you start talking about science. And that's time consuming, and it's money consuming, and it needs skills, and it needs social science skills. Also not only in the research, but in, well, people who want to communicate in the institutions.
Thank you very much for reminding us also about the diversity of skills that we're needing to draw on here. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I've got some really interesting questions. So I'm going to read out the first question and just ask for anybody to indicate that they would like to respond to that question. So this question is from Ekaterina Chukno. Apologies if I've mispronounced the surname there. And she would like to know, would it make sense to engage the younger audiences, that is kids and teenagers, through influencing school curricula or providing additional courses and games, etc., so that interest in science is something people grow up with? Would it be easier or harder to catch the attention of younger audiences? So I don't know if there's anybody who's particularly thought about younger audiences who might like to tackle that question. Anybody want to raise a hand to pick that one up? So Annette, why don't we go to you first, and then Andy, you can be second.
I would say yes, the younger the better, because if you got people in your science boat, it's much easier being adult with all the hassle you have in your head to get them still. And if you connect with young people, children, younger adults even, and try to build up a relation of trust, it's not only information, it's about trust. They're trusting the institution. They may be challenging them with questions, but in principle, there's a certain trust. These are guys I can talk to, I can go to, they give me valuable information and insight. If you build up this trust, you can build on this later on. And if you lose people there, it's much, research shows it, that when you start too late, science communication is struggling to get a hold on people. So the younger, the better.
Thank you. And Andy, did you want to add something to that? And then Vannessa.
Yeah, great. Actually, it's really good that I go after Annette, because what I'm about to say just really connects with what Annette was just saying. In that that question just really brought into mind a case study that I can really remember from our research, and it really relates to building trust with young audiences. And what one of our interviewees described was how when she connected with schools and went into schools, and she had these activities where she took scientists in to describe their research. Often the children were quite reticent to engage with that and found it quite an intimidating environment to be in. You've got a real life scientist, a real doctor, a real professor. How do I even kind of ask? I don't even ask any questions. So she kind of set up this activity where they each had to pretend they were a millionaire. They'd each got €1 million to spend on a piece of research, and suddenly that empowered them to ask the scientists questions. They felt a responsibility with this fictitious money that they've been handed. So I think sometimes it's around setting up the dynamic within the conversation to build trust and build empowerment into that conversation, so that those who may be reticent to sort of engage and ask questions and challenge feel that they're able to do so, and in doing so build up that kind of trust that Annette was referring to.
Thanks very much. And Vannessa, I saw your hand pop up there as well.
No, I thank you, Andy, for this example. I just wanted to underline that children are not blank canvas, and they are also representation of science or scientists or journalism and news. So of course we can think like, okay, let's get them super early so the trust is not broken yet. But actually, a child interacts with the world not only at school, but in their daily life, with their parents, with their peers. So I think we really need to take that into account, and also accept that a child mind is complex as an adult one.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for pointing out that. I saw lots of nodding within the online group of us here when you said, children are not blank canvases. It's absolutely true, and I think that's a really, really nice point to make. We might move on to another question, which again, I'll ask for volunteers to address this. So Adriana Dalba has asked about the role of the media, and in particular the role of the media in spreading misinformation through negative biases for the sake of ratings. So I'm not sure if that's something that anybody's addressed in their research, but if anybody would like to just raise their hand to, yes, I can see Sarah would like to address that one. I thought you might. I'll go to Sarah first, and then if anybody wants to add anything, please do.
That's an easy one for me, that's why. Well, it's this is a serious issue. I mean, this is an issue we are facing in all area. It's the crisis of news media, and it's due to digital advertisement. I mean, the fact that currently, I mean, there is an incentive nowadays to go for clickbait, so which means for headlines that capture people's attention but have little to do with what is written in the text of the article. We've been doing some research in this area, and it's huge, and it's actually exploited by all major media, because the problem is the funding of news media these days. So we are moving to a model based on subscription. So if you want quality, you need to start paying for the quality, because what has been going on is that in the past, advertisement used to fund this quality, you know, because every company, media company, was an intermediary between the final customer and any company who wanted to sell something. But this day, there is just one intermediary, which is Google Ads, and everybody's just flowing money to this digital marketplace for that advertisement. And this is creating true incentive for increasing the spreading of misinformation, simply because it's more appealing. Simply because you know, it's a mixture of entertainment, it's a mixture of fake news, it's a little bit of everything, but it's easier, and and that's why. And also the problem is that digital surveillance, the fact that now you can follow user online, so it's very easy to see what kind of content, and unfortunately, bad content, dry, and especially lies. Drive a lot of attention.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it reminds me of a saying in English, which is, if lunch is free, you are the lunch. And so this kind of movement towards paying for things, if you want quality, I think that's a well-made point indeed. I've got quite a philosophical question to end with. We only have 3 minutes left in the session, but I think it's a really important point from Giulio, and I'm sorry to everybody whose questions I haven't been able to get to. I really apologize for not being able to raise all of them. But Giulio has asked, what's the advantage or reward of spending so much time and money with an audience that is not interested in science? So, big question. Who would like to tackle that one? All right, Andy, you're brave.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I see it in a practical sense, and like I mentioned before, that my background is in commercial journalism, you know, working for organisations, and this is something that's really relevant to that. You know, why spend time and money in reaching out to individuals that don't have that interest? I mean, there was a real there's a line from a research paper that I remember that is looking at how bloggers perceive their audiences, and one of them said, you know, if I'm running a blog about video gaming, I assume that the people who are going to be reading that are interested in video gaming. It's quite a natural thing to do. But I think there's a real incentive, a commercial incentive, from the perspective of growing your audience and developing your audience. And I think that's something to be sort of leveraged, that, you know, many commercial organizations, there has been a sort of crisis reduction, fragmentations of audiences. So there's a real commercial incentive to try and expand and reach others who wouldn't normally engage with whatever it is that you do. So I think I see it in that perspective, really.
Thanks very much. Did anybody else want to tackle that question? Because I think it hinges upon a number of different things. Yes, Annette, go ahead.
Just adding that public radio and public television and all the news agencies and everyone should really invest into audience development. I think that's the major thing. They're still very much concentrated in generating great content, but you have to bring it to people. And that's, I think, a very important thing, which again is not cheap.
Okay. It's right on our end time. So unless anybody's got any last minute thoughts that they really, really want to do, because I think we might be allowed the odd minute extra, I think I will close the panel and thank everybody very much for your contributions today. So I'll hand back to Jason.
Thank you, Emma. What an interesting panel and a lot of really critical issues in relation to audiences and how we respond, engage, and we may see the future with them. We're going to take a short break. After we do this break, we will come back for our keynote speech from Deborah Bloom, but we will see you in just about 10 minutes. That's 10 minutes before 3, so 14:50 Central European time. See you in a moment.